Our coverage of the climate crisis continues ahead of Monday's landmark summit hosted at the United Nations. World leaders will gather to talk climate politics, and many say it will be the most significant discussion on the matter since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015. Joining me now is environmental correspondent for The Nation, Mark Hertsgaard. Mark, thank you so much for being with us.
I'm delighted.
So we all remember back in 2017, President Trump touted removing the U.S. from the Paris Agreement. However, a lot of people may not be aware that he can't legally do that the Paris Agreement was sort of, safeguarded against that sort of thing. Can you explain when the U.S. can legally leave the Paris Agreement?
Ironically enough, it's one day after the 2020 presidential election, which will happen on November 3rd.
And that's a coincidence?
That is not a coincidence.
I was going to say.
No, the negotiators in Paris of the Paris Agreement knew that there would be pressures on governments, not just this one, to perhaps get cold feet. And in order for an international treaty to really hold weight, they said, no, if you sign this, once you ratify it, and it comes into agreement, you have to stay in for 4 years. And it just so happened that that 4-year period extended till the day after the 2020 election, which is part of what makes the 2020 election a climate change election. Right. Americans will be choosing who the next president is who's going to be dealing with this issue.
That's an important point to get across to voters. But I also want to ask you about the fact that, so legally we are still in the Paris Agreement, but we are not meeting our emission standard agreement at all, correct?
The United States is not meeting it, and neither, I'm sorry to say, are most countries in the world.
So that's why this emergency meeting is being called at the UN?
Yeah. Well, and as you know, CBS and myself, as part of the Covering Climate Now collaboration, we interviewed the UN Secretary General yesterday about that and said, you're calling this meeting because the governments are behind. He said, absolutely. And I said, what can people do? If you're watching this program, watching this interview, what's the one thing people can do? And he said, public pressure on the governments is the only thing that will work. And he used to be the Prime Minister of Portugal, Mr. Guterres. So he knows how elected politicians think. And he said, every government in the world eventually has to follow public opinion.
Now, how is China doing? Because, as you mentioned, the U.S. isn't the only one that's not meeting its emission standards.
Well, I've been saying for many years, I've covered climate change since 1989, and was the first Western reporter to go into China and detail their environmental crisis. They and the U.S. are the two climate superpowers. We decide basically what this planet is going to do. And China has actually been well ahead of the United States, shutting down coal plants at home. However, there is a big problem, and Secretary General mentioned it in our interview yesterday, that China has been exporting coal plants. They're doing this massive infrastructure program called the Belt and Road program, where they're basically building from China all the way, ports, railroads, infrastructure, all the way to through Asia to Africa. And they're building coal-fired power plants for that. That's got to stop.
Yeah, definitely. Now, I want to ask you about President Trump's recent initiative to cut emission standards for automobiles in California. He's knocking up against the California government. They don't want to do it. Interestingly enough, there was a surprise agreement between several auto manufacturers, including Ford, BMW, Honda, and Volkswagen, with the state of California that set even higher emission standards. So does this indicate to you that the auto industry itself doesn't even want to lower the standards at this point?
That's entirely right, and that's been clear for months. And the auto industry, along with the state of California, and many other, attorneys general from around the world, or from around the country, have tried to tell the Trump administration, don't do this. This is not what the industry wants. The industry wants long-term predictability. And California is responsible for more than 1/3 of all the cars sold in the United States. What the auto industry doesn't want, it's not like they've suddenly become environmental angels. They don't want two different standards. So they have to have factories that build one car that works in California and one car for the rest of the country. So that's why they're opposed to the Trump administration on this, and the Trump administration nevertheless clearly wants to weaken these standards.
And remind us how important that is. And California has what percentage or what number of the nation's automobiles, and that in turn is a huge global percentage.
Well, it's about 1/3 of the automobiles that are sold in the United States, and that's why California has a special waiver from federal law on this. However, and I say this as someone who lives in California, but I'm not from there, so I'm not bragging about California, but California is the 5th biggest economy in the world, and it is one of the economies that is on track to meet the Paris agreements. California is going to have zero carbon emissions in its electricity sector by 2040, and they're trying to get zero for the entire economy by 2045.
So maybe a representative from the California government should be at this UN meeting, because I understand they want to hear concrete plans, not just pie in the sky.
I'd be very surprised
discussions.
if they're not. The former governor, Jerry Brand, held the previous special climate summit a year ago in San Francisco to set the stage for next Monday's summit here in New York.
Right.
I'd be very surprised if Governor Gavin Newsom of California is not also there on Monday.
So what do you expect to be accomplished at the summit?
Well, the Secretary General told us yesterday, as he's been telling world leaders all along, don't bring a speech. Bring a plan. And what he added yesterday, which is kind of news, is that the only way these heads of state will be allowed to speak from the podium on Monday is if they have concretely committed their country to one of three things. Basically, we're going to meet the Paris targets, or I should say, we're going to make a significant contribution to the Green Climate Fund. And that's how the way that rich countries are supposed to help poor countries basically get off of oil and coal.
So does that mean that the U.S. delegate, the head of the EPA, Andrew Wheeler, will not be allowed on that podium, if those are the standards?
I'm pretty sure we can count on that.
All right. Well, that's unfortunate, and let's hope that something concrete and long-lasting comes out of this summit. We need it.
I certainly hope so. Thanks for having me.
Mark, thank you so much for being with us.